In the heart of Addis Ababa, beneath the marble pillars of the African Union summit, Nigeria's billionaire magnate Aliko Dangote stood before a room of leaders and smirked. Some men wore uniforms to cover their ignorance, he said, his gaze fixed on Burkina Faso's young revolutionary, President Ibrahim Traoré. Cameras rolled, silence followed. What came next was not a political rebuttal, it was a lesson in dignity, defiance, an African truth that would ripple across borders and generations. What happens when the richest man in Africa mocks the poorest only to be humbled by a soldier with nothing to lose but his soul? Tune into Courageous Voices for a story that will leave you speechless. The room shimmered with polished ambition, mahogany tables, gold leaf pens, and men who believe they own the future. Inside the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, the economic roundtable had become less about cooperation and more about dominance. Aliko Dangote leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, eyes scanning the room like a king surveying land he already owned. Some nations, he said, voice smooth as glass, seem to believe revolution is an economic model, but slogans don't build roads. Emotion doesn't generate GDP. Laughter followed, tight and elite, the kind that feared silence more than truth. His eyes flicked toward President Ibrahim Traoré, seated quietly across the table in plain military fatigues. We must move beyond boy generals and into real growth. The jab hung in the air like gunpowder, waiting for a match. Traoré didn't flinch, he didn't even blink. Instead, he reached for his water, took a slow sip, and looked Dangote straight in the eye, expression unreadable but gaze immovable. The roundtable was closed door, no press allowed, but one camera, rigged for internal archiving, was still running. One technician, perhaps too tired or too curious, forgot to mute the backup live feed. Within hours, the moment was everywhere, shared in WhatsApp groups from Lagos to Luanda, dissected on Twitter, played on loop by independent broadcasters. The richest man in Africa had just mocked one of its youngest presidents, and the youngest had answered not with words, but with silence louder than insult. By dawn, the world had already chosen sides, and in that choice, something deeper stirred, because across a continent long bullied by wealth and suits, a soldier who said nothing was suddenly speaking for millions. What secret power lies in Traoré's silence? Stay with Courageous Voices to uncover the truth. The clip wasn't supposed to leave the room, just another AU session filled with jargon and pleasantries, until Aliko Dangote leaned into the mic and said, Africa cannot afford military rulers chasing populism instead of policy. The timing was precise, rehearsed, even cameras captured the subtle smile curling at the corners of his mouth, and the way certain presidents laughed too quickly, too eagerly. The shot lingered on Traoré, sitting still, hands folded, no defense, no reaction, just a quiet nod as if to say, I heard you and I won't forget. The clip hit the internet like dry grass meeting fire. By midnight, it was trending on X under the hashtag dignity versus power. Pan-African youth didn't just share it, they dissected it. Memes exploded. One showed Traoré in silence with the caption, Lions don't flinch. Another overlaid Dangote's words with colonial images, asking, who taught you to mock your brother? In Nigeria, the streets split. Some praised Dangote for speaking hard truths, others asked when wealth had become a license to insult sacrifice. In Burkina Faso, the silence became scripture. No official statement, no televised rebuttal, just the image of a soldier in fatigues nodding as if his ancestors were whispering through him, let them laugh, we remember who we are. By morning, news anchors from Dar to Nairobi were forced to ask a new kind of question. Was this just a clash of egos, money versus youth, or had Africa just watched the richest man in the room mock the only man not for sale? In the silence left by Traoré's restraint, a storm was beginning to form, not in politics, in hearts. The presidential compound in Ouagadougou buzzed with outrage. Screens replayed the clip again and again, the sting of Dangote's words echoing through every corridor. Colonel Sada slammed his fist on the table so hard the water glasses trembled. He humiliated you, humiliated us in front of the whole continent. You must respond. Captain, strategist Fatima Dio, usually the most composed voice in the room, leaned forward with a fury that cracked her calm. "This is not just personal, he's planting a narrative that you are impulsive, that revolution is reckless. If we stay silent, that becomes the truth." Other ministers nodded in agreement. Some whispered about demanding a public apology, others suggested cancelling trade agreements with Dangote's conglomerates, but Traoré remained seated, eyes on the distant hills outside the window. He let the fury play out like a storm that needed to burn itself out. Then he spoke, soft, measured, final. "Let him speak. Truth needs no megaphone. History is loud." Enough. The room fell still. Even Sadu, mouth half open, said nothing more. Traoré rose and walked to the wall where a faded photo of Thomas Sankara hung, a revolutionary cut down by betrayal, not bullets. "They mocked him too," Traoré said, voice distant, but his silence outlived their power. Fatima pressed her lips together, unsure whether she admired the restraint or feared its cost. "And what of perception, Ibrahim? Africa listens to noise, Dangote's noise." He turned to her with a gaze heavy as iron. "Then let them listen, and when the noise fades, we will still be standing." Outside, the city pulsed with unrest, but within the palace, a different kind of fire had been lit, not of revenge, but of something far more dangerous to men like Dangote: conviction. It wasn't the first time the insult in Addis Ababa stirred old ash from a fire few had seen burn. Months earlier, at a high-level West African security summit in Abidjan, President Alassane Ouattara had been the elder statesman, polished, seasoned, seated beneath a wall-sized Ivorian flag. His voice rang with the confidence of someone who'd long made peace with the system. When Traoré stood to speak about sovereignty, foreign manipulation, and the need to dismantle neo-colonial structures, Ouattara chuckled into his microphone. "How poetic," he said, his smile sharp. "But Africa doesn't need poems, it needs plans, and this boy, this soldier is still playing revolution like it's a schoolyard game." The room had shifted, laughter from a few presidents, some uncomfortable shifting in seats. Cameras flashed, a headline wrote itself before Traoré even responded, but he did respond without fanfare. Without even returning to the podium, he walked slowly past the delegation table, paused behind Ouattara, and leaned in so only two men heard what he said. Whatever it was, Ouattara's face stiffened, his smile faltered, hands tightening on the table edge. He never repeated what Traoré whispered, no one else dared ask, but from that day forward, the Ivorian president never interrupted him again. In the corridors of power, rumors bloomed. Some said Traoré spoke of Sankara's betrayal, others believed he reminded Ouattara of the French troops still stationed just kilometers from his capital. But the truth didn't need to be known, it needed only to be felt, and it was now. As Dangote's insult echoed across the continent, Traoré's silence wasn't just strategy, it was history repeating with a new face, the same arrogance, and the same mistake. They still underestimated the boy, but this time, the boy had a nation behind him. The chamber of the Burkina Faso National Assembly was packed. Ministers, students, farmers, journalists, even foreign diplomats leaned forward, waiting for retaliation, for fire. What they got instead was a funeral for illusion. President Ibrahim Traoré stood beneath the national emblem, no teleprompter, no speechwriter's polish, just truth sharpened to a blade. "They say we are poor," he began, his voice steady, eyes unblinking, "but poverty is not born in our soil, it is planted by men who see our land as a vault and our people as silence." The room held its breath. "We are not poor, we are plundered, we are not violent, we are awakening, and those who trade freedom for luxury will one day pay a price no money can cover." Cameras caught every word. Outside, crowds in Ouagadougou gathered around street screens, phones held high like torches. In markets and cafes across Africa, the speech interrupted sports, movies, and sermons. "Let them mock our uniforms, let them call us boys, because when history turns, it won't remember who wore suits, it will remember who stood up." Thunderous applause erupted, but Traoré didn't pause for praise. "To Mr. Dangote," he continued, "and to every man who believes wealth grants wisdom, I do not seek your approval, I seek my people's future." By the time he stepped down, the clip was already viral on Twitter. The hashtag #plundered not poor eclipsed every trend. In Nigeria, Youths flooded the comments with solidarity. In Ghana, students marched holding handwritten signs, "We are not their silence anymore." What had begun as an insult was now a reckoning, and as Traoré walked calmly from the chamber, one truth had crystallized across a continent: you cannot humiliate a man who carries dignity like armor. It started without warning, just a delayed shipment, a missed invoice, a suddenly unreachable trade liaison. Within days, Dangote Cement suspended all operations in Burkina Faso. No statement, no explanation, just silence and empty warehouses. The retaliation was quiet, corporate, and calculated. As cement trucks stopped at the border, construction projects stalled. Investors were warned discreetly that Burkina Faso was becoming unpredictable. The economic pressure wasn't loud, it was surgical. Nigerian media outlets, many with invisible strings leading back to Dangote's empire, began airing segments under the guise of economic analysis. Headlines read like verdicts: Burkina Faso's president risks isolation, populist rhetoric scaring away investors, dangerous nationalism on the rise. One station aired a special titled "Revolution Without Results," featuring suit-clad analysts shaking their heads at young leaders confusing pride with policy, the same talking heads who never questioned foreign military bases were suddenly deeply concerned about African unity. Inside the presidential palace, Traoré's cabinet watched the smear campaign unfold. Colonel Sada bristled with rage. "He's trying to choke us, starve us into silence," but Traoré remained composed. "Let him," he said. "If our independence is paper thin, then it was never real." Fatima Dio, watching the economic data roll in, turned toward him. "They want us to blink just once, and we won't," he replied, "because the day we beg for their cement is the day we bury our own revolution." Across Burkina Faso, construction workers laid bricks with whatever was left in their hands. Some projects slowed, others paused, but no one stopped. Makeshift banners went up at work sites: "We build with dignity, not permission." The world watched to see if Traoré would fold. But something else was happening beneath the surface, an old truth waking up in the red soil of a nation that remembered how to stand without asking. It began with a single voice in Lagos, just a university student standing on a crowded sidewalk holding a hand-painted sign that read, "Dignity over deals." No political party, no union, just raw conviction. But it spread like the harmattan. Within 48 hours, the streets of Ouagadougou swelled with bodies, not out of anger, but out of allegiance. Students marched beside market women, teachers locked arms with farmers. The chants were simple, steady, and impossible to ignore: "We are not for sale, we are not poor, we are plundered." But the real shock came further south. In Abuja, a group of young Nigerians defied warnings and gathered outside Dangote's corporate offices. They weren't angry at Traoré, they were inspired by him. "We've been told to worship billionaires," one girl shouted into a megaphone, "but look what they do when we choose freedom over profit." In Accra, Ghanaian protesters painted murals of Traoré across abandoned construction sites, depicting him not as a hero, but as a mirror of what their own leaders refused to be. In Nairobi, poems were recited at open mics with his name echoing like a drumbeat between stanzas. No speech, no campaign. Just a man who didn't flinch, in a continent that saw in his silence a reflection of their own buried rage. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré watched it unfold on a cracked TV screen in a military-based cafeteria. No applause, no declaration, he simply nodded. "This isn't about me," he said to Fatima Dio, who stood watching beside him. "It's about what they've always wanted us to forget." She smiled faintly, "And now they remember." From Dar to Dar es Salaam, one question began burning in the minds of millions: if silence can spark a revolution, what else have we been taught to fear that could set us free? The great marble hall of the United Nations buzzed with anticipation. Delegates whispered in polished suits, eyes flicking toward the entrance as the young president of Burkina Faso took the floor. No entourage, no notes, just a calm walk to the podium and a silence that settled heavier than any opening applause. When Ibrahim Traoré spoke, it was not in anger, it was in mourning. For a continent buried beneath lies dressed as diplomacy, "I was not born in a palace," he began, voice slow and steady, "but I was raised in a land where gold shines from the ground and children still die with empty stomachs, so, forgive me if I question your numbers. There were no accusations, only truths delivered like verdicts. He did not mention Dangote, he didn't need to. Instead, he spoke of puppet leaders propped up with loans they never touched, of contracts signed in languages their people didn't speak, of foreign bases built not for protection, but possession. They tell us to be patient while they harvest our futures. They call us unstable when we refuse their grip. They call us poor, but we were never poor, we were silenced. The room shifted. A delegate from Sweden stopped typing. A South African minister leaned forward. Even cameras, long used to catching the polished phrases of seasoned politicians, seemed to hold their breath. Traoré looked out over the sea of flags and added, "The world is not afraid of a violent Africa, it's afraid of a conscious one." When he stepped down, there was no thunderous applause, just a stunned echoing quiet like the sound before a dam breaks. Outside the UN, protesters waved handmade signs. We were never poor. Inside, something irreversible had begun to crack. The silence from Aliko Dangote was louder than any rebuttal. Days after Traoré's UN address shook the global stage, Dangote abruptly cancelled his scheduled appearance at the Lagos Global Investment Forum. No reason given, no press statement, just an empty chair where Africa's richest man was supposed to speak. Then came the leak. A confidential email surfaced, first shared by an anonymous journalist on an underground Ghanaian blog, then picked up by news outlets across the continent. The message was direct, almost humbled. My comments were not meant as personal. I regret any harm caused. I would welcome the chance to speak privately. The recipient, President Ibrahim Traoré. The response, none. Not officially, but days later, a simple manila envelope arrived at Dangote Group headquarters in Lagos. No note, no message, just one photograph. A barefoot child stood in the dry earth of northern Burkina Faso, holding a tattered schoolbook with both hands like it was sacred. Behind him, a single solar panel, wired into a handmade lamppost, casting its glow over a chalkboard nailed to the side of a mud brick hut. The panel had been funded not by aid, not by business, but by village donations, mothers selling grain, elders melting heirlooms, youth hauling sand from rivers. The photo spoke more than any televised debate. It said, "This is what wealth looks like when it serves, not rules." Within hours, the image went viral. Artists painted murals of the boy. Pan-African forums renamed him the Sunchild. Journalists dubbed the moment the most powerful silence in modern African politics. Dangote said nothing because how do you argue with a barefoot child holding a future no billionaire could buy? 1 year later, the sun rose over Ouagadougou with the same golden stubbornness it always had, but something had changed. In the heart of the capital, where a crumbling colonial statue once stood, a new monument now reached into the sky, made of clay, steel, and shattered cement blocks salvaged from abandoned sites once promised by foreign contracts. Etched into the base in bold black letters, "They mocked our clothes, we built a nation." The square around it had become a place of pilgrimage, not for tourists, but for teachers, mothers, barefoot children, and revolutionaries who'd never held a rifle. They came not to mourn, but to remember and to remind. Across Africa, the ripple never stopped. In Nairobi, university walls bore murals of the child with the schoolbook and solar panel. In Dakar, spoken word poets recited verses titled "The Uniform Truth." In Lagos, where it all began, youth movements began lobbying for corporate reform, quoting Traoré's speech as scripture. Traoré never once spoke of Dangote again. He didn't need to. He governed, he built, he listened, he walked the same roads as his people, and he stayed in uniform, not because he had to, but because he chose to wear the weight of those who never had a voice. At night, old women told their grandchildren the story not of a feud, but of a silence that roared. And in quiet corners of power, leaders still asked one another what haunted them most. Not the speech, not the protests, not the boy with the book, but the question that refused to die. When dignity is mocked by power, who do you believe? Africa hadn't just remembered, Africa had awakened. If this story moved you, Don't just scroll away, hit the like button to support voices that stand for truth over power. Subscribe for more untold stories that challenge the powerful and uplift the unheard. Drop a comment below. Whose side are you on, dignity or dominance? And if you believe Africa's future belongs to its people, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. This isn't just content, it's a conversation. Be part of it on Courageous Voices.